Hi guys, how's it going? Ivano here, and it's this time of the year again. Since there were finally some balance changes in patch 7.7, I will go over the PvP tier list. So this is for 8v8 Warzones, and I will rank all of the specs in the game from S tier, so very good, until D tier, so not that good. As always, this is only my personal opinion, so feel free to disagree. And most importantly, how well you play a class is more important than what class you play. So if you're a really good Concealment Operative, play that and you will be much more effective than if you play Flavor of the Month, just because I say so. And of course, the most frequently asked question, where are the light side or Republic specs? And for that one, I will link you to my other video where I explain what mirror classes are, so check that out in the description below. But now without further ado, let's go over the classes. Of course, at the top of S tier, last time we had Madness Sorcs. They got nerfed in patch 7.7, but to be honest, the nerf didn't really do anything. I think it was just 10% of the healing of Force Leech, but overall the class is still very strong. Damage is solid, even if you're playing into tanks. Because of all the internal damage, the CC is insane, especially that it comes baked into your rotation. So melees have a very hard time playing against Madness Sorcs, especially if there are multiple ones. And survivability wise, you still have a lot of free passive damage reduction, of course all of the strong Sorc cooldowns. And that is why, even though it got slightly nerfed, Madness will stay in S tier. But in my opinion, it is not at the top of the chart anymore. I think it is a close call, to be honest, but this patch I will be ranking Virulence as the best spec for 8v8 Warzones, because I see a lot of them in almost every game. The class of course didn't get changed in this patch, but it's just overall very, very strong. Passive dot damage reduction makes it really good into classes such as Madness, Pyro and Lethality, which are of course other strong specs in the meta. It is CC immune for 50,000 years, or at least it feels like. Has great team utility with diversion and ballistic shield if you run that. Even has passive self-sustain with the cover heal. Has spread damage via the dots, and it has burst via its tactical. It really has everything you want in a class. Oh, and of course it is also ranged. So Virulence, if you want to be called a filthy Flavor of the Month abuser, now it's time to reroll. Next we move on to Bodyguard. This is the only healing spec that did not get changed this patch, so I will be leaving it in S tier. Very strong healing output, both single target and AoE. And of course the thing that makes it a little bit better than the other healers are the insane defensive cooldowns. Bodyguard just has 3 lives, and as opposed to Sorcerer, it can stay in the fight a lot longer. It doesn't need to kite as much, which also makes it a bit easier to play. So Bodyguard for sure the best of the healers in this patch. Pyrotech, now I've played a lot of the spec, and it is still very strong. However, I'm not quite convinced it's still worthy of this S tier status, because to be honest, compared to Virulence and Madness, you will be struggling, simply because you are melee. And yes, Pyro is really nice, because you have the cooldown reset on Carb, and it is incredibly tanky. But unfortunately, you can really feel the nerf of the superheated fuel tactical, and your Carbonites is not going to help you much if you're playing against Madness Sorcs and Virulence Snipers who are out of range, or in that case, immune anyway. So I will be slightly downgrading Pyro to the top of A tier. Immortal Jug is insane, absolute broken spec. There's not much more that needs to be said. Can do 20k DPS, but it's also a tank, so it has incredible survivability. The difference between Immortal and the other specs is that Immortal can actually kill you single target, while the other tanks mostly do high damage numbers when there's an AoE fight. Immortal can do that too, but yeah, the single target is insane, so it stays in S tier. Next we move on to APPT, of course my favorite spec, but unfortunately I can still not upgrade it to S tier. It's simply not on the same level as Virulence and Madness. The damage potential is better than Pyrotech, but it is not as tanky and probably one of the easiest classes to kill, unless it has guard and heal. However, the burst is insane, so if your opponents are not expecting it, AP is still as fun as ever. So having played both S and with Shield Tech and Darkness in the last patch, I think I will reverse the order here. I think Darkness overall is the stronger tank. It's just really disgusting with the spike spam. Such a low cooldown on a hard stun, and just makes it so you cannot really play the game anymore if you're melee. So another absolutely disgusting tank spec. The AoE damage is insane, and of course having stealth as a tank is another strong point for the spec. Darkness of course is also great if you want to be a solo player and just kind of stay in stealth and then pull people into the fire and hardball. Whereas for Shield Tech that's not really the case. I think Shield Tech overall is probably still the tankiest out of all the tank specs, even when you play it in like a skank setup. And Shield Tech is extremely good at shutting down enemy melees with Stealth Scan, probably the most anti-fun ability in the game right now. But again, if you look at the classes that are on top of the meta and are played heavily, those are not melee classes, maybe with the exception of Immortal. and that's why Shield Tech is still a really strong spec, don't get me wrong, but I will leave it in A tier and slightly behind the other two tanks. So the thing that makes Lethality great is of course dot spreading and cleaving into a bunch of enemy melees. It's also very tanky, has great off heals, however the single target is a bit lacking. I haven't been seeing so much lethality in the current meta, but the ones that I've seen have absolutely shredded when there was like a tank heal game going on. So I think just because people are not playing it as much doesn't mean that the spec is not good anymore. And since at least in the games that I have been in, all of them pretty much have 2 tanks these days, I think lethality for sure is better than the other classes in A tier. It's not quite on the level of Virulence Madness in my opinion, but I will move it to the top of A. NG Sniper, another very strong spec. Of course it's focused around burst and then AoE control. So into melees it's quite good, but if you have a tank that knows how to swap guard, it's a little bit unlucky. The overall DPS is okay, not quite on the level of some of the S tier specs. And defensively, of course, it has most of the traits that make Viro so incredibly hard to kill. A very solid spec, but like I said, just maybe one level below the S tier. Corruption, of course, got nerfed in this patch. The nerfs were to its force sustain, meaning you need to regenerate your force a little bit more, and then those global cooldowns cannot be used on healing abilities, of course. That being said, Corruption is definitely still the second best heal in the game after Bodyguard, and whether you want to put it in A tier or B tier, I think is mostly personal preference. Overall, it's still a very solid heal, great mobility, great heals and strong defensive cooldowns. You just need to manage your force a little bit better. But I have seen some great Corruption numbers already this patch, so I will leave it in A tier. And now we're moving on to the specs that in the last tier list I had in B tier. On the top, of course, we have Lightning, which just got buffed. I played a little bit and I also will upload some Lightning gameplay very soon. So in particular, I tried out the single target, halted offensive build with Elemental Convection. And the damage there was okay, but it's still behind some of the other good single target specs that, for example, are still to come. But then, of course, it's a range class, so probably it should be a little behind these melee single target specs. But for sure, it is not as strong as Madness still. Then, of course, for Lightning, you can also play the AoE build with Elemental Convection and Chain Lightning. That one is quite insane, especially if played into a lot of tanks and melees. For some reason, I don't see anyone really playing it. I don't really know why. Maybe it's just because Madness does more for just pressing 3 buttons. But I think Lightning is actually a very strong spec and for sure viable. So I could even think about upgrading it into A tier. Next, Rage Juggernaut, probably still the most consistent single target damage in the game. It's really easy to do 15k with this one, but its downfall can be the ranged and tank meta that we're seeing at least on Darth Malgus. It's not that great into a whole bunch of tanks, especially Darkness if they keep stunning you and debuffing your accuracy. And of course also Virulence and Madness can be tricky to fight, especially if there's multiple ones. An issue I see with Rage is that the defensive cooldowns are relatively long, so while they're strong, once they are down, can be very easy to chain die on Rage. However, the damage is insane, so for me that's a balanced spec with clear strengths and weaknesses, and I will leave it in B tier. Carnage, of course, had that one crazy patch in 7.7 where the movement speed was absolutely broken. In that case, it was on the top of S tier for a few weeks, but now since the bug with swiftness got fixed, it is in a very similar spec to Rage, I think, where the single target damage is really good if you're proficient on the spec, but it can be squishy, especially if you don't have a heal. Carnage unfortunately doesn't have the best AoE damage in the game, so it doesn't really do too well into a bunch of tanks. And while it's still fast enough to chase down a Sorcerer, overall it's not better than B tier. Vengeance sometimes, as I already said in the past, is the best spec in the game when it comes to doing AoE damage and cleaving down tanks and heals, but probably the worst spec in the game when you're the only melee and getting tunneled by 50,000 range dot classes. It didn't really get changed in the patch. The one thing with Path Cover didn't really change anything. So for sure a very fun class to play and can outdamage anyone if there's like a tank heal stack by just pressing one button with cut to pieces. But unless they change their tactical and buff something else about Vengeance, it will never really be higher than B tier in my opinion. Next, Annihilation Marauder. I don't see a lot of them, they're not played very frequently, and that is because they lack the CC immunity, which the other Marauder specs have as part of their rotation. However, in an AoE fight, it has the highest potential out of all the Marauder specs. The group healing is quite insane. Boss Predation is really nice too. So it's not a bad spec, but for me, definitely not higher than B tier either. IO got buffed this patch, but to be honest, the buff didn't really do anything. Damage is still better than Arsenal, as it was before the patch, but it's not as good as something like a Virulence Sniper. Defensively, it can take a lot more damage, but it doesn't have the CC immunity that makes Viro so oppressive, and the burst is also nothing crazy. AoE potential is there, but it's not as high as something like Vengeance or Hatred. So overall it's a balanced spec. I would maybe rank it slightly above Annihilation just because it got buffed this patch, and it means IO stays in B tier. Now we have Hatred Assassin. Damage is very crazy, but is probably the squishiest melee spec, and because survivability is very important in PvP, in most games Hatred is just not surviving long enough to apply its crazy damage. Arsenal got buffed, but to be honest it still feels the same as before. So I played a couple of games, I hit some crazy priming shot crits up to 140k in the Void Star, but the DPS unfortunately is still lackluster because it's too dependent on hitting those big white damage attacks, and of course white damage attacks in a meta where there's tanks all over the place and you play against Madness Orcs with 10% defense chance, and Virulence that have a passive 20% defense chance when in cover is just not going to do very good sustained DPS. So the burst is actually nice now, it hits really hard. If it hits, and that's a big if. So maybe I would upgrade it to the top of C tier because it is tankier than Hatred, but they just need to buff the yellow damage or just give all the classes 10% passive accuracy in PvP. Then Arsenal would be playable, I think. Okay, next Deception Assassin. Deception got a buff. They reduced the internal cooldown of Duplicity and increased the critical damage of Maul a little bit. It still feels really good if you're stomping in a game, and you can actually get resets and burst people down, but the weakness is still the same as it has been throughout the whole 7.0 expansion. Whenever there's a halfway decent tank in the game, or there's a bunch of snipers, which of course there are many in the meta right now, Deception just doesn't really do a lot. It's way too easy to kite, and the AoE, even with may cause injury, is not that strong as some of the other specs on the list, which is why, at least for Warzones, I will keep it in C tier. Marksman Sniper got buffed, and even though this was only a small buff, if you're playing the Agitating Energies tactical, Penetrating Blast feels a lot better right now. So Marksman DPS is probably on a similar level, or even better than some of the specs we have in B tier. The AoE potential is insane just by spamming Suppressive Fire. Burst is not that great because if you're running Agitating Energies, then your ambush doesn't really hit all that hard. And for sure I would like to see them change it to make it more of a burst spec again. Maybe make the roll ambush tactical baseline or something. But defensively it is of course very strong. It shares the 3 rolls and phase walk with all of the other snipers. So after the buff in 7.7, I will be upgrading Marksman to the bottom of B tier. Next we have Medicine Operative. They got some small buffs to their healing, but to be honest in PvP that doesn't really do anything, because healing output was never the problem, and the weaknesses are poor survivability, extreme reliance on guard, and also on the skill of the player, because if you are ever caught out of position, or you simply have a bunch of melees targeting you, you are going to melt like butter. It's unfortunate because Medicine is actually a very fun spec to play, and could be a good counter to the dot meta that we're seeing, but overall it just needs a defensive cooldown, or it must have guard, so I cannot really put it any higher than it was last patch. Fury Marauder at the bottom of C tier. To be honest, I would not change anything here. It is kind of a worse version of Rage Jug, and I know, yes, if you have an AoE game and you're taking all of the AoE utilities, it can do good DPS, but even in those games, Rage and Vengeance will usually outperform it. The single target is not great after they lost the auto crit on Berserk, and defensively, while it does have CC immunity, it doesn't have the off heals of Annihilation, and isn't that much tankier than Carnage either. So unfortunately Fury is really in need of buffs, and I will leave it in C tier. And finally Concealment Operative. This one really depends what you do. As you know, my tier list is mostly focused on fighting, and I think in the big team fight, Concealment is probably still the worst spec in the game. Yes, the burst is crazy, but if you're playing against decent players and tanks, they will see it coming because it takes a while to set it up. Simply pop a defensive or use guard, and then you are kind of useless because your mobility is just not good enough. You're gonna get rooted a lot by the likes of Viro and Madness, and you can never get into range to apply your actually decent damage. On the side of survivability, of course, it's also not as good as Lethality, especially in this dot meta, and the only thing it's really good at is playing pylons and of course Hardball. But since this is not an objective tier list, Concealment unfortunately stays in D tier. So there you have it, not too many changes in the tier list actually, but at least we got to see some balance changes. And I really think we need to see some nerfs to the skank tank and range dot meta. They would make the game a lot more enjoyable in my opinion. But as I said, that's only my opinion. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this list. And of course, as always, if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to leave it a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.